Greetings and welcome. My name is Dan Biederman, and I am a partner in the Working Capital Innovation Fund, which is a venture fund. We invest in early stage companies that are trying to solve labor rights problems in global supply chains, mostly using technology. Thrilled to be here and joined today by a wonderful panel that is both global and representative of a range of the stakeholders who need to be at the table in order for us to solve the kinds of problems that we're exploring today in this panel and that the Global Forum is exploring more generally. Namely, I'm joined by Shubha Sekhar, who is responsible for human rights, sustainability, and CSR as the regional director at the Coca-Cola Company. I'm joined as well by Keelong Fu, who is a director at Tatwin, an important and sustainability-oriented latex provider to numerous global brands. And last but not least, by Leanne Melnick, who's head of global supply chains at the technology company Diligence. You're here and you will hear today us discuss how a global company, a big company like Coke, a large supplier like Tatwin, and a tech company have come together in different configurations to explore the problem of exploitative labor recruitment and how they can use technology to put themselves in a position to solve that problem. This is a problem, needless to say, that is both large, extreme, and persistent. The problem itself is related to labor migration, where people, particularly cross-border labor migrants, are facilitated to cross borders, happens domestically as well, by often unscrupulous recruitment agencies and labor intermediaries who place them in jobs. They charge those workers fees, and those fees are often more expensive than workers can afford. They are certainly almost always more expensive than the legal limits that governments place on them. And they are furthermore almost always more expensive, more costly, and higher than the limits that individual companies place on the ability of any individual business in their supply chain to charge workers for job placement. This leads to debt bondage. It leads to a situation where workers are too in debt to their employer or to this third-party agency to be able to leave. It is considered, according to the ILO definition, a form of forced labor. And indeed, according to the most recent global estimate from the ILO and Walk Free of the number of people in forced labor and conditions of modern-day slavery worldwide, 50 million people estimated worldwide, 1 in 5 are in a condition of debt bondage that binds them to their employers and prevents them from having the freedom to leave and switch jobs. We can think about this as a problem in the informal economy, but it's very much a problem in the formal sector as well, in mining, in quarrying, in construction, in agriculture, but also in manufacturing. I mentioned that it's a long-standing problem. I remember back in the early days of my joining Verite in the early 2000s and even back to 1998, when my colleagues in Southeast Asia, particularly Maria Postal, identified this unexpected phenomenon of severe labor violations, discrimination, the withholding of passports, severe underpayment of wages in factories in countries that were middle income and therefore not necessarily expected to see really extreme labor violations. We traced that back and found that it related to the fees that workers pay and the debt bondage that they experience in the formal sector, in the supply chains of many multinationals. It is a problem that we at Verite and numerous stakeholders have now worked on for close to 2 decades and are at this point very clear both on the manifestation and on the locations and on the problems and the impacts, and still really searching for solutions at scale. It's the solutions at scale that bring us to this conversation today, and indeed that underlie the investing that we do at our fund. We're looking for ways to put in place solutions and systems that can reach the large number of workers who face this problem in global supply chains without necessarily replicating the timely and cost and labor-intensive efforts of doing detailed investigations at each facility. And so we want to hear how these very thoughtful and legitimate actors, a large company like Coke, a large and sophisticated supplier like Tatwin, came together with Diginex to find new approaches to this problem, leveraging technology. I will start by asking Shubha, representing Coke, how did your company come to recognize that this was a problem that you needed to engage and indeed felt comfortable and competent to engage? And then additionally, as you carry on, how did this lead into your partnership with Diginex?
Thanks, Dan. It is a pleasure to be here today. And greetings to everyone from New Delhi, India. The Coca-Cola Company is committed to preventing the use of forced labor in our supply chain. And our human rights policies specifically prohibit the use of all forms of forced labor. We are a founding member of the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, which advocates for the employer pays principle focused on preventing the charging of any recruitment fees on migrant workers. The company has also committed to the Consumer Goods Forum's priority industry principles on forced labor. Now, in order to test adherence to our human rights policy, we conduct third-party assessments of a Tier 1 supply chain to verify the situation on the ground. Each year, the company facilitates more than 2,000 assessments of company locations, of franchise bottling locations, and our top supplier locations. Now, while we put in solid efforts in testing adherence to ethical recruitment principles through workplace assessments and capacity building of our supply chain constituents, there were a couple of issues that we faced specifically in addressing the modern slavery risks. First is, unlike risks that arise within the four walls of a factory, much of the modern slavery risks arise much before the workers come into the workplaces in the receiving countries. So the workplaces in foreign shores are really like the tip of the iceberg. We therefore felt the need to go both deeper and wider to address modern slavery risks, particularly in high-risk markets like the Gulf. Now, deeper means going beyond Taiwan, and wider means including third-party labor agencies in the due diligence process. The second is, while auditing has its importance and benefits, it does not reach the contracting level in the country of origin as a worker comes to the foreign country through a network of agents. And third is the need for a cost-effective solution. We started our original pilot work with Diginex in 2019, looking at how technology could be used to address issues related to contract substitution in the Gulf. Now, during the pandemic, while recruitment was paused, it gave us an opportunity to reflect on our learnings from that first rollout. After many rounds of discussions with Diginex, we realized that the need was to develop an end-to-end due diligence and governance model that also includes recruiters and third-party labor providers. We wanted it to be in a partnership mode, and after making presentations at various forums, along with Diginex, we're happy to have Reckitt join us. It was helpful to have another brand and an ethical recruitment agency, that is Terra, and an NGO which had a lot of experience in this space, namely Mekong Club, join us and help shape Lumen. This could help us to gain better transparency over the recruitment process and help in addressing the complex issues with support of ecosystem players.
Shubha, thank you for that. Vital, I think, to point out that no single actor in the space can solve this problem in and of itself. And so rightfully recognizing that Coke is part of and helps facilitate and stimulate an ecosystem solution. Suppliers, employers are, of course, a different part of that ecosystem. Let's hear next from Keelong Fu of Tatwin, a global latex supplier, that itself had to come to a recognition that the problem of debt bondage among its employees was one that it could solve, and that ultimately Diginex and the technology played a role. Let's hear next from you, Keelong, please. Same question. How did you come to this, and how did you end up in a partnership using technology?
Thank you, Dan, and hello, everybody. I'm Keelong from Tatwin. As an upstream manufacturer of natural rubber latex and based in Thailand, Tatwin supplies a wide range of supply chains. So these end products are used around the world, and they include bedding products like mattresses and pillows, healthcare PPE like medical gloves, surgical gloves, condoms, and even consumer products like apparel, balloons, and adhesive. So our production lines are based in Thailand, and our workers are mainly made up of migrant workers, and most of them are from Myanmar. In recent years, with the passing of human rights due diligence legislation in the global north, there is a clear macro trend where customers across our supply chains become increasingly concerned for suppliers to adhere to the human rights due diligence legislation in time as they come into force. So with the majority of our workforce made up of migrant workers, who are an especially vulnerable group to this risk, the focus is now on our organization's effort and ability to stamp out this systemic risk. So in the early part of Tubman's journey in striving to align with the international standards on recruitment, a misconception we had was that we could just engage a well-established labor recruiter with our stated requirement and to fill up our workforce responsibly. So disseminating these policies that require zero recruitment fees and that to labor recruiters will be adequate. We believe that this would become a blind spot in the later part of our journey, as we soon found out it requires much more than that on the part of the employer. So the key challenge is that this forced labor risks they're never one-off. They're always recurring and they're constantly evolving. So these risks are not easy to detect, and as the migration journey for each migrant worker is long and seldom direct, and fees and debt recruited to recruitment are paid to layers of agents and sub-agents who may very well be the migrant worker's cousin, friend, neighbor, or even their village hitman. So Tubman is committed to the employer pays principle. However, it becomes clear to us that upholding the principle requires active surveillance beyond passing along the policy requirements and the cost. It requires the building of an active labor migration management system that comprises of clear policies, strong due diligence, fair remediation, and constant engagement with workers. And realizing that need of the strong due diligence, this is where we come to Diligence, seeking their technological platform to see how we can do the due diligence. Thanks.
So explicitly, it sounds like to extend your ability to do effective diligence in this very highly complicated, as you say, I think really important, dynamic, ever-changing situation. Seems like a perfect place for technology to intervene. Leanne, how did Diginex come to focus on this problem? What are you trying to achieve, and how have you put in place a system to address it?
Thanks, Dan. First of all, hello everyone from Vancouver, Canada. My name is Leanne from Diginex. Yeah, so it was definitely it was a big task or challenge, I should say, that was given to us by Coca-Cola. And at the time, we were also engaging with Tatwin in a project with IOM as well as IKEA. And what we saw across the board was that there was this very big need for solutions that were scalable. And I think that was probably the biggest challenge that we faced in our initial sort of pilots with our earlier tool that we had done with both Coca-Cola, Reckitt, as well as Tatwin, is that it was very much a factory by factory solution. And supply chains are big. And then if you take the labor supply chain on top of that, it's incredibly complex, as you mentioned, reaching across different geographies. And I think one of the things that I learned really early on from doing a lot of research on this topic when I worked at the International Labor Organization was that to understand responsible recruitment holistically, you really need to have the perspectives of suppliers or of the employer, from recruiters, as well as from workers. And so that was sort of the first thing that we wanted to build, was a system that could accurately capture the voices of these different parties in the labor supply chain. The other aspect was about transparency and just starting to have a little bit more of a holistic picture about where the different parties in the supply chain were sitting. Most brands and retailers will have, and often even suppliers, they'll have visibility up, as Shiva said, to the tier one, but they won't necessarily understand who the recruiters are in the countries of destination. Perhaps they'll know the names of the labor agencies, but they don't know where the labor agencies are recruiting their workers from. So that was one of the first things that we were trying to look at, was also not only just how do we collect different voices from the supply chain, but also how do we actually map out the labor supply chain? And then finally, how do we have an understanding about their own due diligence practices from each one of these parties? And then how do we bring back this immense amount of data and give it back to the employer or the end brand in a way that is actually understandable and actionable?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Leanne. Again, applying technology to a really complicated problem. Let's get into a little more detail about both like what it is, what are you actually doing together, and what has emerged? What have been some successes, and certainly let's get to what have been some challenges too. Leanne, back to you for a second. Just when this tool, when Lumen is implemented, what's happening? Give me a minute or two on just like the specifics of the technology, not in code terms, but in operational terms.
Yeah, so there's sort of three big steps, I'd say, in the rollout. So the very first one is that either the supplier or the brand goes on and they will invite their business partners to the platform. And the platform operates in the way of cascading invitations, which is really meant to facilitate that cascading due diligence process that really sort of ensures that there is implementation of these standards along the supply chain. So Shiva, as Coca-Cola, would go on and she would invite her suppliers to the platform. The suppliers would be invited to fill out a due diligence assessment that really dives deep into recruitment and recruitment practices and the traditional ILO forced labor indicators. What's important about it is that it really sort of distills down not only just, okay, do you have a policy, do you not? But it really looks at the quality of that policy. What are the provisions that are included? What is the breakdown of that fees and costs that are being paid in both country of origin and along country of destination? How are these policies actually being communicated out to your business partners? Are they included in contracts? What are your own grievance processes? How do you actually track those grievances? So it really dives deep into both the quality and the implementation of those policies and practices and management systems. After the supplier fills out their assessment, they would be invited to have their own workers participate in a worker voice survey. So what we did was we actually integrated in a worker voice tool called Apprise that was originally developed by United Nations University, Macau, as well as the NGO that focuses on forced labor based out of Hong Kong, Mekong Club. And with this tool, it has about 18 different languages, facilitating a multilingual workforce to provide data around forced labor indicators and what's actually happening in the workplace. Now, this is important because it actually acts as a check on the data that is submitted by the suppliers and the recruiters. So it's twofold. It's actually having a pulse on what's happening on the ground while verifying the data that's submitted through the due diligence assessment by suppliers and labor recruiters. To access the surveys, the workers would just bring up their mobile phone. They can scan a QR code. There's other ways of doing it, like some brands choose to actually go in person to the workplace and hand out different QR codes to the workers. But the idea is that you would get back a standardized measurement of workers' experience related to those different forced labor indicators. Now, after you have the data coming in from the workers, the suppliers are invited to invite their own labor agencies as well as their recruiters to the platform. So then the labor recruiters and the labor agencies come on and they tell you about their own due diligence practices and their own management systems related to responsible recruitment. Now, sometimes there is even a fourth step, and that just shows you about the extent of these labor supply chains. And that's that sometimes the labor agencies and the recruiters will invite their partners in the country of origin. So we have successfully reached down now to many, many different recruiters in the country of origin, and then they share about what's going on with their first step related to those workers and going through that labor supply chain.
Awesome, thank you. Much clearer picture now. And Shubha, certainly it seems to meet your sort of expectation and desire to have an end-to-end due diligence mechanism. What ultimately has this meant for the Coca-Cola Company? What has allowed you to see or learn or achieve? Give us some examples, if you can, of how this has advanced your practice as a company.
Sure, Dan. The project is at a pilot stage with some of our suppliers in the Gulf, and so there are learnings coming in as we speak. So some of the successes that I'd like to highlight is, firstly, as Leanne said, that we have been able to reach deeper supply chain ties and get a better understanding of who they are and what they are doing. And this is definitely a big step forward. Secondly, as the tool has modern slavery focus, it does effectively identify and address red flags, and this gives us a much better granular understanding of the specifics. Thirdly, as Leanne pointed out, collecting due diligence data from multiple actors helps triangulate information collected, and it reduces the risk of bad data. And fourthly, as we mentioned and also had a discussion on this a little earlier, it is helpful that there is no per supplier or per worker cost for each engagement. This makes it easier to drive the work in the supply chains. Now, if there is a cost at each level, that becomes a stumbling block at each stage of the supply chain. And making this cost effective, where the brand pays for the tool with no further cost to the suppliers and deeper supply chain constituents, really helps us keep focus on the work rather than having discussions on who bears the cost, etc. Now, this has all been a learning, and it's a very complex space. So there have been some challenges, or I'd rather say that there are opportunities for improvement. So one is that though Lumen is a easy to use technology-led platform, and Leanne has explained the cascading process through a simple email, but there is need to build comfort of all users. We need to understand and appreciate that they are deep down in the supply chain, and there is need to provide handholding at the initial stages. But once this is done, the process becomes much smoother. Secondly, most Tier 1 suppliers don't have the right expertise, not tools, to monitor the supply chain. There is need for engagement, aligning, developing their ownership of their supply chain, and this obviously takes time to establish. Unfortunately, there's no magic wand, but capacity building, engagement, and tools like Lumen will help them realize the importance of this work. Third is that as a corollary to suppliers not having the expertise, not having the monitoring tools, suppliers with lower due diligence controls tend to work with high-risk business partners, and this therefore becomes a challenge that one needs to address. And last but not the least, definitely more efforts are needed to normalize the inclusion of recruitment and labor agency actors in the due diligence process. When this is not normalized and one is doing the heavy lifting, there is a lot of efforts that need to be put in by folks on the ground to make the supply chain constituents understand the importance of this work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shubha, for the articulation, right, of how this has been operational and how Coca-Cola Company's taken on the cost, and it sounds like led to much greater understanding and knowledge, but also it's a human change. It's a change management process, right? It's about implementing a new tool in a group of people who maybe are not fully familiar with it. Keelan, let's hear from you. Similarly, sort of what is it the implementation meant for you as a company?
Actually, we came to Diligence actually because of COVID. So pre-COVID, Tawin's human resource team was we actually have to travel to Myanmar to directly interview and recruit the new migrant workers because we were very aware of the risks involved. So at the country of origin, our human resource team will have to verify the supporting documentation. We'll conduct face-to-face interviews with the new recruits, and we try to identify common human rights risks like child labor, if there's any withholding of their passports, their travel documents, if there's any fees that's related to recruitment that's charged, there's any debt. And we also try to assess their understanding of their employment terms. We found that there's usually the employment contract is not in their language, or usually there are multiple copies of employment contracts. They probably will sign one at the country of origin, and they will sign one when they arrive at the country of employment when they reach our production lines. So with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of the national borders, it's no longer possible for our team to continue the practice of the direct recruitment for the longer term. So luckily, in collaboration with Diligence, we can actually use technology, the Lumen system, to actually conduct these due diligence practices using the platform. So in collaboration with Diligence, we developed a pre-migration survey for the workers to detect the vulnerabilities before they start the migration journey. And the use of the technology allows us to conduct the risk assessment remotely and efficiently. And definitely, like what Shubha said, it's very effective for us to do it at scale. And using the Lumen platform, our HR team was actually able to collect and map out the data of the workers at risk and also the nature of the risk involved. And we were also able to identify the actors involved in this violation so that our team can seek to change these practices and to terminate their relationship with Tadwin.
Wonderful. Thank you. Leanne, you mentioned earlier or actually, Shubi, you mentioned the sort of the integration with other actors, recruitment actors. And Leanne, I know you've done you've had conversations as you've developed the product with recruitment agencies, labor agents, others. What has been your learning from those other actors, those who are normally left out of diligence processes, or at least are harder to reach, as you've tried to develop the Lumen product, and as you've tried to think about how to make sure that it can effectively reach those who are, maybe not the most influential in the sort of process of recruitment, but they're certainly highly influential, and they've been the toughest kind of diligence nut to crack, so to speak.
Yeah, the first thing I think we learned was very much echoing on what Shubha was talking about earlier about the need to include these actors in the process. I think there was actually a genuine sort of surprise oftentimes when we come to them and ask them to fill out their due diligence information, because oftentimes this is the first time that these actors are being engaged or being asked these questions. I remember there was one labor recruiter in particular who stands out in my mind. And he told me, he said, well, I think this is a fantastic tool that you've developed. And I do think that eventually this is going to drive change. And he goes, but you do realize that this is just a drop in the bucket. And he goes, in this rollout, I have two clients that are asking me to undertake this exercise. And he goes, what are you going to do about the other 99 that are not? Sorry, the other 98 that are not? And that sort of made me pause for a minute, and it really brings it back to that question of how do we make sure that more business actors are asking these questions and monitoring due diligence mechanisms related to recruitment beyond the immediate supplier level. So I think we definitely need more momentum in this area. We need more people asking questions. The other one was a sort of genuine surprise on the part of suppliers. When you'd come to them and say, hey, we'd like to, try this system, and you can roll this out with your recruitment actors, and they take a look at the questions and they'd say, well, we're supposed to be asking them all of these questions. I thought I only had to ask them for the business license. And there is sort of this genuine confusion, I would say, in the supply chain about what due diligence actually means and what due diligence actually means about forced labor and recruitment practices. So I think that the platform was a very good way to sort of standardize that understanding about the level of due diligence that should be needed at the start of these RFP processes. And then lastly, I'd just say that there was actually a very great willingness on the part of most of the suppliers that we've been working with to engage with technology, even though it has been a struggle about, okay, yes, that's not the registration page, that's the contact page that you've just filled out. Like there's a lot of that. There is a lot of handholding that needs to take place. But at the same time, suppliers were very excited about the prospects of having a tool that was provided to them, that they could afford, that they could actually use to undertake this continuous due diligence process over their recruiters. They a lot of them actually understood that it's very, very hard when you have these different actors that are sitting in another country to actually understand what is going on. And so I think there was sort of an excitement that there was a tool now that they could use on this, and also a tool that had features for them that engaged them. Like I think to date, a lot of the technology tools that are out there are very much sort of top-down, brand-driven, fill out this survey, and then that's the end of it. Where Lumen, the thing that is I think maybe unique about it is the fact that it really does empower these suppliers to manage their own due diligence process with their own business partners. And it also has a lot of different features that actually help them. So there's a reporting feature, there's dashboards, there is benchmarking of different suppliers. And so all of this really, really helps those suppliers to understand what it was that they needed to change to make sure that they had a very robust system in place that they could then communicate to new prospective customers that are coming through and looking for business.
Awesome. Right. I mean, people will people will change their behavior, whether you're in a business or whether you're just me, for example, when it's either easy to do so or you feel compelled to do so. Shubha and Keelong, you've described you both represent large institutions that have had to change and have decided that it's important enough to look at this set of problems in a way that is unusual, if not unique, or at least at a leadership level. And Leanne, you mentioned, right, the experience of talking to that labor recruiter who articulated that he or she is being asked to do deeper diligence by a tiny fraction of his or her customers. Shubha, how did you overcome or rather, what do you think is needed sitting in a company that has effectively created partnerships with other companies, big companies, specifically, as you mentioned, with Reckitt in the rollout of Lumen? What needs to happen so that more big companies like yours recognize that there are easier and effective ways to do something that everybody needs to do, and in fact, there's an imperative to do so?
So this requires a multi-pronged approach. Having good, cost-effective, scalable and workable models on the ground will definitely help. So for example, sharing learnings of initiatives being taken by brands helps in its uptake. So in the case of Lumen, Coca-Cola and Reckitt had shared the learnings of the pilot at a forum of leading FMCG brands. And I understand from Diligence that some brands have expressed interest in this work. Secondly, it is very important that cross-sectoral partners come together to work on this complex issue holistically. And so need to make ethical recruitment viable for recruitment agencies. Also, brands coming together on this platform helps amplify the message. And last but not the least, there is need for capacity building of recruitment agencies and labor providers.
And Keelong, from your perspective as a supplier, Leanne mentioned, right, how this is making it easier for suppliers, employers to engage diligence not only in your own work, so to speak, but cascading. How compelling will that be to others in your space, perhaps to your competitors or others who are operating in similar place in the supply chain, suppliers to large brands? And what needs to happen so that more institutions like yours, more companies like yours know about and or can adopt, can decide to adopt tools like Lumen?
They firstly, I think uh, when we started the project with Diginex, as a supplier, we are at the very upstream. So I think the cascading would, it really reach us on the upstream. So uh, we definitely were afraid of the data. We were afraid of looking bad in front of our customers, that the data will prove to be, detrimental to our business opportunities with our customers. But over time, we realized that we are an organization that were frequently audited, using social audits, or our customers will engage third-party audits, much like what Coca-Cola has done to their suppliers. Um, we have passed all these audits, or we have already rectified all the issues. But after using the Diginex Lumen system, we found that there's a difference. The Lumen platform was able to digitally conduct the risk assessment organization-wide, as opposed to the social audit being conducted on randomized or selected workers. So this is the difference. And we found that the Lumen system was much more comprehensive than what the social audit has done. And this has allowed us to actually follow up on what are the issues. So we can actually conduct group interviews with our team to understand the nature and the severity of the risk. And we actually found that many of the workers, they accept the existence of the recruitment fee, showing that this is actually a systemic risk. And they may even cooperate with the agents to evade our questions to detect those risks in order to breeze through the process, the recruitment process. And we found through all this data that we had with Lumen, that the most common risk that we found was really the charging of the recruitment fees. And by charging these fees to the workers, it will lead to many of them resorting to being bonded to them. So back to your question, if how do we actually implement it to the other suppliers? It will really take the management and the whole team to be really genuine in really been trying to solve these issues. And then you are actually, once you have actually rectified that and you are able to systematically use technology to mitigate these problems, you're actually future-proofing your business. We are actually able to operate our business, and we have a very comfortable view for the mid and long term, knowing that all these sustainability goals, development goals that are in place and that will come. For example, next year we were going to have a lot more legislation. For example, the German Due Diligence Act, which we are also a major supplier of latex in Germany. This will come in January 1st, and we are already well prepared for all these due diligence legislation for our customers, and we can really get a competitive advantage over our suppliers in the sense. Yeah, I hope that answers your question then.
A great answer. Love it.
Sorry, I was just going
Go
to
ahead,
say,
Leah.
if you don't mind me jumping in with one really quick last point on implementation. We're just about to start a sort of group rollout actually with the AIM Progress group. So we've got a group of companies that are just starting to look at sort of how can we use new technology as a way of driving responsible recruitment throughout the supply chain. And I think that one's a really positive example of implementation as well, because I think one of the common challenges that you see with addressing responsible recruitment in the upstream parts of the supply chain is that it's great when you have a wonderful supplier like Tatwin, but let's say you come across a not so great supplier or a not so great recruiter. What do you do? And I think that the notion of sort of joint leverage and using this issue of, while there's a lot of problems in the upstream supply chain, it's very good to use that challenge as an opportunity for collaboration across different brands. And so what we've seen in this initiative with AIM Progress, which involves different brands, including Unilever and Reckitt and Coca-Cola, is that you see these different companies coming together And what they're doing is they're recognizing where they may have a shared supplier, and they're using their collective leverage to drive change amongst these different suppliers and labor recruiters. And I think it's something that should be replicated more with different industry initiatives. So I think that would be also my challenge, is that if you are an industry initiative that has just adopted a pledge on responsible recruitment, bring your companies together to use that joint leverage to actually drive change in the upstream parts of the supply chain with recruiters, with labor agencies, with suppliers. Because if we use these industry collaboration groups more to focus on implementation instead of just adopting these pledges and then hoping that stuff trickles down, I think we will start to see a lot more positive change and action throughout the supply chain.
Yeah,
Shubha, let me give.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Keelan, no, go.
Yeah, I must say I have to agree, you know, when we get questions from some of our other customers who are trying to adopt all these practices, like they're trying to trace back to their supply chain. It's just like what Leanne say, you know, they don't really know how to do it, and they want to ask us how do we do it. So we can actually say, you know, this is what we have done with this major brand. We have this platform, and this is what, you know, the risk that we have covered and the implementation process that we have done. It's actually easier for us to sort of replicate that and let it cascade down to the customers from the other brands they are trying to convert from their pledges to actually doing something, some actions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks. Shubha, let me give a last word to you. Thoughts in particular about what should come next, and or what lessons you would like to leave the audience with about Coca-Cola's experience diving deep and partnering with a tech company to try to solve some of the longstanding problems that have existed in your supply chain and others.
Technology will definitely play an increasingly important role in the next decade of due diligence. It needs to be part of a basket of due diligence tools. And along with it, there is need to take other steps like embedding such requirements in business processes, ensuring there is capacity building. And this is extremely critical. In case of Lumen, for example, we spent a lot of time initially in socializing the tool with our own managers in the region and with suppliers, and in making them understand the importance of the subject and of deeper due diligence. Apart from this, as it is extremely complex, going beyond one country, going into deep supply chain, etc., there needs to be more and more ecosystem players coming together to build leverage and amplify the message.
Thank you so much. And from my perspective, in conclusion, I guess I've heard some themes that are vital to emphasize. One of which, Keelan, you mentioned, it's future-proofing your business. It's ideally providing a competitive advantage. No longer is the idea of ethical procurement, responsible production optional, particularly as legislation now requires diligence deep into supply chains. We're at the early stages of implementation of that legislation, but it's not going away. And it is no doubt going to provide an opportunity for suppliers such as yours to distinguish themselves by the depth and the nature of your understanding of your own supply chains and your controls over it. Certainly, Shubha, this is absolutely has to be implemented as part of an ecosystem of change, ecosystem that includes other big company actors, other private sector actors. And frankly, the demand for responsible recruitment and the commitment to ensuring it has been missing from many companies, not yours, and not those that are around the table in the Global Forum and at IHRB, but increasing the sort of the effort, the understanding of how to put in place a sort of an ecosystem approach that includes a variety of steps. It seems to me is just must be a priority from partners of yours in the multinational community. But then, Leanne, you've offered, and Diginex through Lumen has offered a way to make it easier and make it more simple to do these very complicated things, namely to create transparency deep into supply chains and to gather these other voices, both of the businesses that have been left out of these conversations frequently, but then, of course, very importantly, the workers themselves, who are not only vital for testimony and for ensuring the accuracy but for sharing their own experiences as the rights holders in this conversation. And ultimately, if we have more companies around the table like yours and they implement technology solutions like Lumenmore, ultimately we'll see really measurable benefits to potentially millions of people. Benefits not only to the places where they work, but benefits to those workers themselves and their societies and their communities and of course their families. And that's what we're all aiming to achieve. I'm grateful to have been able to join you all together and to hear your stories. I'm really thrilled that we have particularly private sector companies that are willing to talk about the challenges and the difficulty. I'm glad we're at a stage in the development of this problem and the solutions that it's no longer something we just try and bury our heads in the sand around, and we at least admit, as you did, Keelong, that there is scary stuff out there potentially, but only by embracing the scary stuff are we going to solve the problem. And as you said eloquently, I think we'll be in a position where business is seen to benefit from control and understanding of these risks in their supply chains. So with that, I'll say thanks, and we'll close this session. Thanks particularly to the IHRB. Thrilled to be part of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment yet again. And thanks very much to the panelists.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.